All right, welcome back. If you made it this far, you're doing excellent. We're going to step away from geometry nodes for a little bit, and we're going to go into the world of shaders, which is really fun too. So follow me over to the shading workspace. And before we get to any actual shading, what I want to do first is add in kind of a utility object. And this is going to serve as basically a placeholder for working on shaders before they actually get applied to the objects that they're meant to be on. And you can put this object wherever you want. I'm going to put it in, I think I'll put it in this environment collection in the viewport. Do Shift A and add a cube. And then move this along the x-axis or whatever. Just kind of get it a little bit out of the way, but near enough to the geometry nodes object that we can kind of see both at the same time. And this object, I'll just rename that shader placeholder. And so we can use this object to create shaders and work on them and recall them later. It's just a little trick that I like to use. There might be a better way to do this, but I've gotten used to doing it this way. So this is what I'll use. So let's start with some simpler things. Let's go ahead and with this utility object selected, just hit new up here in the shader editor window. I'm going to move this viewport window a little bit to the left so we have more room in the shader editor. We can keep the principled BSDF shader for this. This is fine. This is going to be our land material. So we'll just call that land up here. And you can change the base color to something pretty dark, something like 0.2, 0.02 or something like that. And maybe the roughness a little bit up, or actually let's take that down just slightly like that. Okay, so that's land. Let's leave that there for now. We can delete this material from that object. It's okay, it's still in Blender's memory. Like we can recall it later, but we just needed to get it, bring it into existence first, and then we can assign it to things later. Then we'll add a new one, same button. We'll call this one water. And again, bring the base color down pretty dark, somewhere in there. You can maybe make it slightly blue if you like. And this is going to be the material that we're going to assign to the water area. And let's see. Okay, so while looking at our cube, we can work on this water shader. Now, there's a number of ways to create things that look like water. There's displacement modifiers that you can actually change the shape of the vertices of the mesh and all of that, but that's a lot of work. And I think I just want to do something quick and kind of painless, hopefully. And it's not going to be as good as those options, but what I like to do here is just add in a Musgrave texture. And just like in geometry nodes where we were previewing specific nodes with Control-Shift-Click, we can do that with any node in the shader editor too. We can just do Control-Shift-Click here. And now we're seeing that Musgrave texture applied to this little utility cube. And I want to use that height output and send it in to the normal input of the shader. But this normal socket needs normal information. So to convert that, we're going to use a bump node. And we'll send that normal in there, and we'll send the height in here to the height of the bump node. And now let's do Control-Shift-Click on Principled BSDF shader. Now we can kind of see what's going on there. And this scale is a little bit much. Let's maybe bring it down here, and the strength is pretty intense. So bring it down there. That's going to be the basis of our water, and I think we'll want to take the roughness down of the Principled BSDF, something around maybe 0.1. Okay. All right, this is pretty basic, but let's go back into geometry nodes and select the object. So we bring back our whole tree that we were working on before, and to apply materials to something procedurally generated by geometry nodes, we need to assign that material in the tree itself using a node called, and I'm in the planet surface group here. I'm going to search for a node called set material. I'm going to add that into this section right here. Remember, all this is the water. So this node here is going to be setting material on that geometry. So we can select here water. And just to check things, we can change our viewport shading to material preview. And sure enough, we have our water applied there. I think we're going to need to adjust some of the Musgrave texture scales, but at least we have it applied there. And now for the land, remember the land is coming up this way. We're going to add a set material node to this part right here. So I can duplicate this with Shift D, tuck that right in there, and change the material to land. Okay, so now I see the land has its material. Perfect. All right, let's go back to the shading workspace and then select this utility shader cube. I'm going to bring that a little bit closer to the planet. And I want this is not watery enough for me. I think I want to change the scale of the Musgrave texture, something like that. And you can really change this. You can change these values and just kind of arrive at something that you like. I think maybe the strength is a little bit too high, something around here. It's definitely not fantastic water, but it's going to be good enough for our needs. You're not really going to be able to see in detail the surface of the water when we're done shading everything. So let's just leave it here for now. We can always come back and update it if we like. All right, now let's move on to the buildings. These are going to be a little bit more complicated, but you're ready for this. So let's do that now. We're not going to use the utility cube for this one like we just did for the water and land. We're going to go right to the building itself. So let's disable the main scene in the outliner and then recall, well, my assets collection is already enabled. So we just need to make sure that at least one of these building collections is enabled. We can go in here and just look at one of the buildings that we made. It doesn't really matter which one. Just need to work with one of these at a time. So let's select this mesh and then we'll click new for a new material. We'll call this one building big. Let's make this base color pretty dark as well, something around 0.03. Now, if your buildings, like mine, have multiple objects in them, we want to make sure all these objects also have that material applied. And a quick way to do that is to select all those different objects with shift click, and then your last selection is going to be the one with the material applied. So that's this big mesh here. And what I can do then is hit Control L and link materials. It's just a quick way of quickly assigning different objects to the same material. Let's leave this big panel, this big kind of neon sign thing that we're going to do. Let's leave that for later. And right now we're just going to concentrate on the surface of the building itself. Okay, first thing I want to do is give the sides of the building a little bit more of an interesting texture. Right now it's very flat. It's okay, but I want something a little bit more interesting than that. So with Shift A, let's add in a Voronoi texture. And let's just take a look at that with Control Shift click and see what's going on. Okay, it's doesn't look useful right now, but trust me, we're going to use Voronoi texture a lot in this tutorial. It's super useful. It does a lot of cool things. But if you take a look at this, you can see that something weird's happening. We have different objects in this collection, and they're each getting kind of different scaling and different, like, these are not at all looking the same. They're kind of receiving the Voronoi texture at different scales. We can fix that with something called a texture coordinate node. We're going to place that right here, and there's different ways of generating coordinates that textures use to apply themselves to a surface of an object. I'm not going to go into all the detail here. I'll address them as they come up, but the first one that we're going to be using is object, and I'm going to send object into the vector input of that Voronoi texture. Now you can see that things look a lot more uniform. They're not perfect. They don't actually line up here, but that's not a concern at this stage. We can come back and fix that later, but this is just kind of really gets us closer to where we want to be in terms of scale. But let's return back to this Voronoi texture and take a look at this. So there's different methods that Voronoi texture can use to create patterns over an object. The default is Euclidean. I want to change this to, let's change this to Chebyshev. And do Control-Shift-P one more time on here to get to the color output socket. And you can see this is a little bit interesting, right? There's some sort of geometry and beveling and some kind of like interesting pattern happening here. And we're going to use this to create some interesting paneling. But this is way too varied. I think we want to just take the scale way down. Something like that, maybe something pretty small. Something in there, maybe take the randomness down just a little. Nope, keep the randomness to 1. And then take this 3D drop down, change that to 4D. And what 4D does is gives us access to a W value, which is really just like a seed value. It just kind of changes. You can go ahead and change it. It just changes the variations of the texture. It doesn't change the scale or the randomness. It just kind of gives us a bunch of different infinite kind of looks. So we just change that to something, whatever looks good to you. Something like that. Maybe take the scale down a little bit more. Now, since these are all colors, I can access their RGB values by separating that color. So I'm going to pull this out. And when I release, I'm going to search for separate XY. You can use separate XYZ or separate color. It doesn't really matter. XYZ and RGB, it's going to give you the same output. So I'm going to use separate XYZ. And now if we preview this with Control-Shift-Click a couple times, you can see that I'm seeing the different values of R, G, and B expressed in grayscale. And I can use this information to create some color variation in the base color of the whole building. And we're going to do that with a color ramp. I'm going to add in a color ramp here, and I'm going to make this color ramp a range between two kind of dark colors, something like that. And I'm going to send in one of these values. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to send in X, and let's preview the color ramp. And now you can see that it's getting a little bit of color variation on the surface of the building, which is kind of what I want. I'm going to send that color into the base color of the principal BSDF, and then let's preview this again with Control-Shift-Click. And now you can kind of see that there's a little bit of color variation along that Voronoi pattern, which is kind of cool. But it's still super flat, right? I want something a little bit more kind of panel-y than that. And this is where we can use a bump node again. So let's add that in. Let's add in a bump node. We'll feed the normal into the principal BSDF. And now we can provide some height into that. And we can do that from the same Voronoi texture. So let's use the X or red values of that color texture that the Voronoi texture generates. Plug that into the height. And now you can see that it's got some nice kind of bordering on that paneling. We can adjust the strength a little bit. So it just kind of gives it a little bit more of an interesting look to it. Okay, now let's look at these nodes as we're creating them. And let's do a little bit of organization here. I'm going to pull this texture coordinate out a little bit to the left because we're going to be reusing this. This is going to be providing data to other nodes. And this material output is our final shader output. So this stuff in the middle, I think I just want to collect this a little bit and organize it. So let's select these and Control J to join those, and we'll F2 to rename that building base or something like that. Okay, so we have this thing that's responsible for just the face of the building itself. And we can add some weathering and wear to this if we want later, but let's just do one thing at a time. Okay, still with me? Let's do this next level. We're going to level up here. We're going to add in a bunch of nodes up here to generate windows. So we're going to put a bunch of windows in the building, and they're going to be emitting light, and some of them are going to be brighter than others, and there's going to be randomness and all that stuff. So let's do that right now. And I'm going to start with another Voronoi texture. So Shift A, search for Voronoi texture, throw that in there. And I'm going to use the same object coordinates for this one as well. And real quick, object coordinates really means the basis of, or the origin for the XYZ coordinates of how a texture is applied to an object is going off of its origin. So in other words, the 0, 0, 0 point, which is right here. So it's kind of taking this and plotting XYZ coordinates all across this whole thing based on the origin point. That's what object means. But let's head back up to the Voronoi texture that we just added, and let's take a look at this one with Control-Shift-P again, right? That should look familiar. But this time I'm interested in the distance. You can see that it's a very kind of giraffe-y, gradual black to white pattern that it generates. This is going to be useful for us. Notice if we take the random all the way down, we get kind of like a very orderly, blocky, kind of brick-like orientation. And if we use another color ramp, we're going to be using a lot of color ramps. So let's put another one in here, drop it after distance, change the method to constant, and we'll drag this color stop in here, and then change the Voronoi texture generator from Euclidean to Chebyshev again. And now we have these nice clean squares, but they're kind of inverted. I want the squares to define where the windows are, not where they're not. So let's invert these color stops on the color ramp. And now this gets a little bit closer to what we want. And these windows are a little bit big. So let's take the scale of the Voronoi texture. Let's make this a little bit higher. Really, it's what you want, but I think I want something in somewhere around here. And you're going to have to mess around a little bit with the scale so it catches the surfaces correctly. But I think I like something around there. We can always change this, of course. Okay, good. Now, one step at a time. There's going to be a series of steps here to get these to look like real windows. But first of all, obviously, the roofs of things don't have windows. They're only on the sides, right? So let's deal with that first. Now, we're going to go back to the texture coordinates, and there's another output called normal. Normals tell us which direction something is facing. So we know that roofs face up, and they don't face to the right or to the left, at least most of the time. So what we can do is use that information to define where a roof is and where it isn't. And where it is, we don't want to have windows. So I'm going to pull out this normal information and release this and search for separate XYZ, because we're interested in the Z component, or the upward facing component of all these normal values. And if we preview this with Control-Shift-Click until we get to Z, we can get the Z value of the normal. The more white it is, the more up it's facing. And since the shading isn't quite perfect on this model, the normals are actually a little bit messed up, what we need to do is check to see if the Z value is high enough where it's considered up. So let's add in a math node, and let's drop it after Z. And we're going to say if it is greater than 0.5, I think that's going to work, then that's going to tell us where a roof is, which seems to work pretty well for us. So let's, actually, you know what? Let's invert this and say less than. So it tells us where roofs are not, which is kind of, we're more interested in that than what a roof is, right? So let's do that. And in fact, I'm going to show you one more trick. Let's duplicate this texture coordinate, use the normal from this. This is going to be the same values, just using a separate one. And I'm going to bundle this together because we're going to be using this a few times in different places. Let's bundle this together and select all those nodes and then hit Control-G. And now you'll notice something happens. Everything changes. We're now inside of a node group that we just created, and it has its own input and output. Let's tab out of that by using the tab key. And now we're back to where we just were. And now you notice that those nodes that we selected and hit Control-G on are now replaced by this thing called node group, which we can give a name. So let's call this not roofs, because this defines where roofs are not. And if we select this node group, and tab into it, we can access the details of that node group. We might need to come in here and change things, but for now, I'm just interested in what this produces, which is where roofs are not. So the white is where roofs are not, the black is where roofs are, and we're going to use this information to cancel out things that we don't want to have on roofs, like windows. So let's move this up here a little bit, and let's preview the output of this color ramp. Remember, this is where we were kind of starting to generate our windows. And if we multiply these two values together, we're going to cancel out the areas that are black, and then we're left with the sides. So let's do that now. We'll add in a math node. We'll set that to multiply the output of the not roofs and where the windows are currently. And if we control shift click this, now we'll see that windows are not on the rooftops. Now we still have an issue with this spire here, but we can come back to that. Okay, I think this looks pretty good. It's still not perfect, for example, in here, but that's more due to the Voronoi texture scale kind of catching some strange angles than anything else. I'm not too worried about that for the moment, but now's a good time to group these together and group those with Control J and F2 to rename these windows. But now there's way too many windows, right? Doesn't look good. So let's try to decrease the number of windows that are illuminated. And we can do that with the same Voronoi texture, except this time we're going to use the color information that it produces. So let's preview that with Control Shift click 2 times to get down to the color output. And you can see each color is different, and we're going to use that to decrease the brightness of windows randomly. But first, let's remap those colors to grayscale values with another color ramp. So let's add in ramp, drop it right in beneath here, provide the color to the factor, and let's preview the color ramp now. Now you can see these are all black and white, or just different values between black and white, or 0 to 1. And we'll use this now and multiply it again. So we're going to be multiplying our output here with what this color ramp provides. Let's preview this now. Now you can see there's a little bit of variation in how bright these windows are, and I can use the color ramp to control that variation. We can bring these in, move them around, change the color stop value by selecting it and clicking on the color swatch down there, decreasing this to whatever you like. We're going to have to mess around with this a little bit later when we get to emissions and kind of composing the whole scene, but let's just get something roughly that looks good, something in there. But still, the windows are perfectly distributed around the building. I want to interrupt that and kind of disrupt that a little bit, so it's a little bit more real. It's too perfect. Well, I can use another Voronoi texture to achieve that for us. So let's drop another one. In fact, let's just duplicate this one with Shift D, move this over here, and let's preview the distance on this again, except this time let's take the random back up to 1. And we're going to provide the same object coordinates to this Voronoi texture. And once again, we'll drop in another color ramp off the distance, change this to constant. Let's drag in our last color stop, and you can kind of see this produces a nice random blocky texture. Take the scale down, something around here maybe. It's really up to you, but I think something around there might look good. So now this is going to give us regions where the windows will be showing, and the black regions will be kind of canceled out once we do that multiplication. So I'm going to duplicate this multiply. I'm going to keep kind of cascading these multiplications down as we get more and more defined and more specific about where the windows are and where they should not be. So let's drop that output from the color ramp, preview this with Control Shift click, and now we can see that's getting a little bit more random. I think I like how that turned out. Now, one last multiplication. Notice each time we multiply, we're getting more and more specific. We're canceling more areas out that are black. we're going to do that one more time because I don't love how windows are way down here at the bottom. The further up the building we go, the more windows I think I would like there to be. This is just weird down here. So let's do something about that. And I can get information about how far up or how far away from the origin something is by using this object coordinates information directly. So I'm going to drag that up in here and release that and use a separate XYZ node, drop that right into this group. And then if I Control Shift click once, twice, 3 times, I can now see that I'm starting with black at the bottom, and it gets more and more white as I go up. In fact, it gets so white it's beyond white, and that's why it's glowing at the top. It's actually going from a value of 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to actually way beyond 1. That's why it's super bright up there. And we can fix that by remapping those values with a map range node. I'm going to drop that right in here after the Z output. Now I know I want these values to go from 0 to 1, so that's what the 2min and 2max represent. So those are covered. It's just a matter of what should the from min and from max be. Well, the from min is already 0. The from max is some value beyond 1. I'm not sure what it is. We're going to have to basically find that or approximate it. So I'm going to drag this from max up till I think that's about right. So we're going from 0 to 1 here, so I get a nice smooth gradation. In fact, I can even find out what the value really should be. If I hit my N panel up here and look at the Z value, or the height of this object, I can see it's 4.7 meters tall. So if I make this 4.7, that should technically remap this nicely from 0 to 1. Now notice these other objects on the building aren't really responding well to this. That's because the origins of these objects are different than the origin of this main building object. We should actually set these to be the same. In the end, it might not matter, but as long as we're working with the material on the object, we might as well deal with it now. So let's select each object. I'm going to select this one right here and make sure that the cursor, the 3D cursor, is at the origin of this main object that we want to normalize it to. And we can make sure that that is the case with selecting this object and hitting Shift S and then cursor to selected. And then the object that we want to reset its origin to, we want to do right click, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. So we just set this object's origin to where the 3D cursor is, which happens to be at the origin of this object. Okay, that was a lot, but let's do that again. So I'm going to select this object, right click, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. Okay, that takes care of that one. Let's do the same thing for these other objects. Might be able to do this all in one go, I'm not sure, but oh well, one at a time. Okay, so now all these objects have the same origin as this one. In the 3D viewport in the shading workspace, the origins are for some reason not shown. You can turn those back on by going to the overlays here and then ticking on origins. So now we can see that orange dot there. So all these objects now should have that orange dot in the same place, which is going to make our object coordinates be normalized for everything. So a little bit of housekeeping there, but it should help us visualize things from here on out. All right. Back to what we were doing. We were wanting to have more windows up here than there are down there. So that's why we kind of dealt with this map range and the object coordinates going in the Z direction, right? So now if we multiply all the work that we did before with all of this and view that, now we should see windows getting darker at the bottom and lighter at the top. All right, now let's zoom out and just review quickly what we've been doing. We constructed our kind of base material for the whole building. Let's preview that again with Control Shift click on this final principal BSDF shader. We remember that. So we had these color variations and some paneling work. And then we worked on all these windows here. We kept on multiplying things together to get more and more specific, eventually to get to this result, which is what our windows currently look like. Now we can change these values here and tweak these to whatever we like. But I think this is pretty good as it is. But we might want to come back and change some of this stuff. And we can label this so we know what it does. So let's label this as, let's see, window distribution. And we can label this one as window, let's see, light strength. And this one is going to be window size, I think, right? Yep, so that's window size. All right, this is good. I think let's leave Windows as it is. And let's start bringing some of this stuff together at the very end. Remember, this material output is what we actually are going to see, and we're not really dealing with the results of these two groups that we were working with together yet. So we're going to have to add in a mix shader node. We're going to drop that at the very end. And this mix shader, we're going to be using this a few times in this tutorial, but what this does is take two shaders, mixes them together with some kind of weighting between the first one and the second one. Basically, that's all it does. But let's not connect it with anything yet. Let's sever that with control right click, which is kind of like a knife. We can take that right off. And what we want to do is mix two things together. We want to definitely mix what we've produced here, the building base. So let's have that be one of them. So let's make that be the first shader. And we want the windows to emit light. So let's add an emission shader. And we're going to drop that one into the second slot. Let's make that emission strength something around maybe 15. Okay, that's really bright. But hang on. Remember all this work we did up here. Let's preview this with Control-Shift-Click. This is where we defined where windows are. Well, we're going to use this information to govern the mix shader. So let's take the output of that, plug it into the factor of the mix shader, hook the shader up to the surface, and now I should see emission where there were windows. We're going to have to adjust the strength of the emission and maybe some of these color ramp values here, but we're getting to a pretty good spot. I can already see that some of these windows came back, so we'll have to adjust that a little bit. In fact, we can do that right on the map range by taking the from min and increasing that a little bit. Something like that should work. Not bad. And the emission shader, I think let's make that more of like a blue color. So let's make that something up in here. I think might look pretty good for us. All right, cool enough. Okay, this is looking pretty good so far, but I want to make this a little bit more cyberpunky and add in some vertical kind of like glowing columns of light or stripes of light, like really just thin columns of kind of emission lighting. I think that'll look really cool in a scene like this. So let's use this space right up here for that. And we're going to be taking advantage of the same object texture coordinates that we've been using for everything else to do this. All right, let's start with another Voronoi texture, using this a lot. And if we send in the same object coordinates to that Voronoi texture and preview this with Control-Shift-Click, I'm seeing that familiar kind of giraffe-y sort of pattern. That's definitely not what I want for stripes, but that's because this texture coordinate information is receiving X, Y, and Z coordinates for the whole object. So, which is what it's supposed to do. But let's just use the X values. I just want to use values that kind of run across sideways. So we can add in a separate XYZ, drop that right in this vector, and now we're splitting out just the X values from the whole texture coordinate and getting just those values. And you can kind of see that this Voronoi texture, it only has the X coordinate to work with. It doesn't know what to do with anything else. So it's only able to show those values, which is actually what we kind of want. And to get a little bit more definition, I'm going to add in a wave texture, drop that in right beneath here, and multiply these two things together, just like this. And let's multiply that together. And now we're getting bands, but you can see that there's a little bit of variation in the intensity of these bands, and that's coming from the Voronoi texture. Otherwise, if we preview just the wave texture, we would be just getting like really crisp, even stripes, which I kind of don't want. So let's go back to this preview, and we really should be providing the same texture coordinates to the wave texture. So, and rather than having a million noodles coming off of one socket of the texture coordinate node, let's split this off nicely over here. And we can do that with a shift right click and drag, and we can create a little offshoot of it right there. So let's add that in there. And now we kind of make sure everything is nice and normalized. All right, so where were we? Okay, we were multiplying these together. Now let's tighten these up with our old friend, the color ramp. So let's add that in here. Set this to constant and drag that color stop in just until you start seeing some very thin white stripes like that. I think that's kind of what we're going for here. Now I don't want these stripes to run across the roofs. I think that looks a little strange, but luckily we made a not roofs node group. So we can add that in here and take advantage of that work we already did. And the cool thing about node groups is they show up in search. So if we do Shift A search, we can type in not roofs, bring that in here, and we can duplicate this multiply because we're going to multiply these together. And now if we preview this multiply, we see that there's nothing on the roofs anymore. So that's kind of the power of node groups. Okay, quick moment of housekeeping. Drag all these to select all those nodes, and we'll join them with Control J and F2 to name those streaks, I guess. Okay, so we have these nicely set up. Let's move this guy in here like that. All right, so we've got the building base, the windows, and the streaks. Right now, streaks isn't doing anything. It's not really figuring into anything, although right now we're previewing it, so it's kind of going directly to the output. That's why we're seeing just black and white. But eventually, what we're going to do is create another mix shader and mix another emission in here, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's finish with these stripes. Now, I don't really want them to go completely the length of the building. I want these to be broken up and a little bit random. And one thing that we can do again is, if you remember back in the windows, we used a Voronoi texture to break up the window distribution right in here. And if we look at this Voronoi texture here, actually the color ramp, we can kind of see that we created this blocky texture that's really nice for randomly kind of canceling things out and breaking things apart. Let's use that same technique up here. So let's add in another Voronoi texture. Add that in here. Provide the distance into a color ramp. Set to constant. Let's bring that in halfway in for now. Let's give this Voronoi texture the same texture coordinates that everything else gets. And let's take a look at the output of this color ramp. Oh, we need to change this to Chevy Chev so we get the block texture. And let's bring this in a little bit, change the scale down somewhere around here. Let's start there for now. And then let's multiply this yet again with what we were doing above. Preview that with Control Shift Click. And you can kind of already see now that the streaks are being broken up a bit. We can determine how much they're broken up by the color ramp stops and the scale of the Voronoi texture. And here, just do what you think is gonna look good. I think I don't want too many, something around there. It might look pretty good. That even might be too much, but again, when we start pulling the scene together, we'll come back and adjust this. Okay, so we have our streaks, or where streaks should be, coming out of this group up here. And we want to use this black and white information that we're currently looking at to drive another mix shader. So let's duplicate this one and let's send in, I'm holding Control and clicking on this node noodle to bring it into the vector. So we have this information going straight into the factor of another mix shader. And now let's just stack this together. So let's send in the shader that this was producing. Let's just pass that right in to the top input of this mix shader. Let's send in the final shader into the surface of the material output. So nothing really has changed. But what we can do now is add in another emission. I'm going to duplicate this one. And let's send that into the second slot. So now we should see those streaks come out as emissions. Let's quickly review. Let's take a look at the output of this one. Now, wherever things are white, we're going to be using the second slot in this mix shader, and wherever things are black, we're going to be using the first slot. It's kind of like 0 or 1. That's basically what's happening. So let's preview our final mix shader. So we're all set to go here. We're almost done, I promise. One last tweak here to set this thing up. And that is the color of this final emission. I don't want everything to be the same color. I want these to be different from building to building. And we can do that with a cool trick. It's called the object info node. And what this does is say, for every object that this shader is attached to, generate these unique values. And one of these values is a random number between 0 and 1. And we can use that information to drive a color ramp. Again, there's a lot of color ramps here. We can set this to constant. Let's bring this stop in, and we can add one more color stop with this plus icon. And we can copy this color here with Control C if we hover our mouse around the color chip, and we can paste it in one of these slots. So to make sure we're using the same color, let's paste it in this one as well and change this color to maybe like a pink color. You know, whatever you want, whatever you think looks good. Maybe this color is like more of like a red tones. And now this random number between 0 and 1, we can drive the factor of this, and it's going to be basically be selecting one of these three color values that we distributed along this ramp. Send that final color, whatever it is, into the emission color, and we should get some random color for the streaks. This one happens to be, the random number that it generated happens to be in this range, so that's why we get that pink color. All right, so now for every building on the surface of the planet, we're going to get some different random number here, so they'll all have different streak colors, which should look pretty cool. Okay, now this is a great time to come back to this side panel, this kind of bright panel that I think is going to make the scene look super cool. Let's make a new material for this. Let's just call it panel, or maybe just like building sign or something like that, whatever you want. And now for this one, let's get rid of this principal BSDF. Let's hit X to get rid of that one. And we'll use a mix shader. Drop the shader into the surface. And we're going to use two shaders to send into this mix shader. One is going to be transparent BSDF, and the other is going to be an emission. So we'll send an emission to the second slot, transparent into the first slot, and now this factor is going to decide which is which. So wherever things are 0, we're going to be transparent, and wherever things are 1, we're going to have this big panel be emitting light. Let's make this pretty powerful, like maybe 15. Okay. Now there's going to be a lot of buildings on our planet. I don't want everyone to have this panel. I only want some of them to have this bright panel. So let's use the object info node again. And remember, for every object that this material is attached to, we're going to get a random number between 0 and 1. And using that, I can create kind of like a control that's going to let me decide how many of these buildings are going to even get this emission shader at all. And the way to do that is to send in this random value into a math node and say, let's see, less than some threshold. And that's going to be either 1 or 0. It's going to be true or false. So I'm going to send that value into the mix shader. And let's say if it's less than, let's see, maybe 0.25. So really that's saying if this number is less than 0.25, then this is going to be true or 1, and it's going to get the emission shader. So really this is like saying 25% of the time this panel is going to be illuminated. And the only other thing we're going to do is to make this a little bit more interesting than just a rectangle shape. And we're going to use that kind of Voronoi block texture sort of trick that we were using earlier. We're going to use that here. Let's add in a Voronoi texture here. Let's send the distance into, let's send this into a math node this time, and we'll use less than here. And we don't have to send in any texture coordinates for this one. It should be just fine. And we should preview the output of this. Remember to change that to Chebyshev, random to 1, and the scale down to something. Okay. And while we're at this, we've been using this technique enough times where this is a good candidate for a node group. So let's make a node group out of this. Let's select these 2 nodes, hit Control G, and now we have a node group. And if we tab out, we can see that we have a node group. And let's name this something like block texture. Now notice we can't really control anything directly here. We have to select it, tab into it, make changes here, and so forth. The real power of node groups come when we provide the group input with parameters that we can change. So that's what we're going to do right now. Let's send in the threshold, or the kind of the degree to which we want things to be black or white. And then let's send in the scale. And I think that's going to be it for now. Let's tab back out, and now we can see that we have access to those values here. So we can change the scale, and we can change the threshold of how much black or white there is. So let's make this pretty high, maybe the scale, I don't know, something, whatever you think is good. And now we can use this block texture and multiply it with whatever's coming out of here. Let's do that. So drop in a math node, set the multiply, these 2 things together. Let's preview this with Control-Shift-Click now. Okay, that looks good. And we're going to send now this into the factor instead of the original, either all 0 or all 1. Now we get kind of a more interesting shader coming out of here. Let's hook up the mix shader to the surface. And now we can kind of get a little bit more of an interesting pattern for this panel. And we can adjust this now to something that might look better for us, whatever we want to, whatever looks good. All right, we are done with the big buildings. This is the hardest part of this tutorial, I think. So you're doing great. Now on to the smaller buildings. So I'm going to uncheck this big buildings 1 collection. In fact, I'm going to uncheck the whole buildings big collection as a whole. And then let's go into our small buildings and pick one of these. Doesn't really matter which one. Okay, let's look at this guy. Okay, I'm going to select that object, add a new material. I'm going to call this building small. This is going to go a lot faster. Let's make this a pretty dark material as well. Let's select these other objects, select the final object and hit Control L and then link materials so they're all using the same one. Let's drop in a texture coordinate. We're going to be using object for this one too. Now let's take advantage of those node groups that we created earlier. One of them, remember, was not roof. Let's bring that one in, and then let's bring in the one that we just created. So I think it was called block texture. Let's bring that in. Okay, I'm going to preview these just to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Let's preview that one. All right, okay. And let's multiply these together. Let's preview this. Okay. All right, I think now we can change the scale of this and maybe the threshold so it's not as much light. And we're going to make one change to the block texture. Let's select that one, tab into it so we can edit it. And let's expose the vector coordinates outside so we can control that from outside the node group. Let's tab back out. So now we have a vector input to the block texture, and this is going to be a texture coordinate that we can provide it, which is going to be the object coordinates for this whole thing. All right, things look a lot better already. I think what I want to do, I want to make an adjustment to the scaling of the object coordinates. I kind of want things to be a little bit more flat than squarish. So we can do that with what's called a mapping node. And this mapping node is really meant to shift and rotate and scale the coordinates before they're sent in to be used by some texture or whatever. So let me give you an example. So here we can kind of change the location of the coordinates in any direction we want. And we can also scale them, which is, I think that's what I want to do now. I think I want to scale them along the Y and then along the Z. I think I want something more kind of squashed like that. And let's see, maybe take the scale up. This is gonna be another kind of just mess around with it until you like what you see. We're gonna probably have to do this again when we kind of compose the whole scene together just to make things look like how we want them to, but this will get us going in the right direction. All right, let's leave this here for now. Okay, and finally we need another mix shader node because we need to mix in this base material with some emission shader because we want these little buildings to be emitting light as well. Actually, let's put the principal BSDF in the top slot, the emission shader in the bottom one. Let's make that quite strong, maybe 30. And then all this work we did up here, we're going to send that into the factor. Okay, so that is basically windows of our little buildings. And let's randomize the color of that emission shader while we're at it. And we know how to do that. Remember the object info node and our trusty color ramp node. And we can pick a few colors for this using another color stop. And let's just select some fun colors. Something like that. Let's add in the color to the emission and then provide that color ramp with some random number between 0 and 1. It's looking pretty good so far. All right, now let's make sure that we go to the other small buildings and apply this material that we just created. So let's select that object and select building small and make sure that we have all objects in that collection using building small. Let's go to this final building. Make sure we assign building small. All right. And I think we need to go back to the big buildings. I don't think I applied the material to these other ones as well. So let's make sure they get their appropriate materials. So let's select this whole thing, the object that we just applied the material to, and hit Control L and link materials. And we have one more big building to go. All right. Okay, let's disable the assets collection, bring back our main scene, zoom out a little bit and see what we have done. Things are starting to come together. We definitely have some tweaking to do with the lights and stuff. We'll get to all that in a second, but let's just let's celebrate what we've done. This was a long video. Congratulations for making it this far. We're going to be adding some fog and mist and make it this really dystopian kind of cyberpunky vibe and tweaking some of these lights and really making this whole thing come to life. So I'll see you in the next video.